Hi, today we will explain the storyline of a film called The Da Vinci Code, which was released back in 2006. This film is about Professor Robert Langdon, a symbol expert working at Harvard University who was asked to crack the code created by Jacques Sonnier before he died.
What about that figure on the right hand of our Lord? See?
The film begins with a scene where Jacques Sonnier was chased by a man in a museum. The man was named Silas. Silas chased Sonnier to find something that he was hiding. When Sonnier told him where the object was, Silas shot Sonnier in the leg and left the museum. In a different place, Professor Langdon was signing his book. Then soon Lieutenant Calais came to Professor Langdon. He showed a photo of a murder victim with a symbol on his body. He was asked to translate the symbol.
Capitaine Fache is waiting for you.
Professor Langdon met with Captain Bezu Fache. He asked the reason why Sonnier, a curator of the Louvre Museum, asked Professor Langdon to meet him.
So, Sonnier requested tonight's meeting.
When he arrived at the scene, Professor Langdon looked very surprised to see the corpse of Sonnier on his back with marks all over his body made using blood.
The pinnacle is a pagan religious icon.
Professor Langdon and Captain Fache examined the various symbols on Sonnier's body, and thought of various possibilities regarding the symbols drawn by Sonnier.
Oh, draconian devil.
Shortly afterward, Sophie Neveu, a French police cryptologist, delivered a secret message so that Captain Fache would not know. Professor Langdon asked Captain Fache for permission to go to the toilet. There he met with Sophie and discussed the issue of Sonnier's death. It was known from Sophie that all this time Captain Fache suspected Professor Langdon for the murder of Sonnier. Captain Fache suspected Professor Langdon because in Sonnier's message written in blood, he requested that Professor Langdon be found.
Who are you?
Professor Langdon again asked why Sophie was hiding this information from Captain Fache, and it turned out that Sophie was the granddaughter of Sonnier.
Jacques Sonnier was my grandfather. If you help me understand why.
They both escaped from Captain Fache by tricking him by throwing the GPS tracker that had been placed in Professor Langdon's pocket into a car. Professor Langdon and Sophie were still at the Louvre Museum and re-examined the body of Sonnier. They found the fact that the message that Sonnier wrote was an anagram that led to Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa painting.
Devil, a lame saint, becomes Leonardo da Vinci.
Professor Langdon and Sophie again found various kinds of anagrams written by Sonnier in each of da Vinci's works, until they found a key called the fleur de lis.
So dark, the con of man.
Careful.
Sophie remembered that the key belonged to Sonnier. Professor Langdon asked Sophie to recall whether Sonnier ever kept a secret of a meeting related to the monastery of Sion, because the key was the symbol of the Abbey of Sion. While Professor Langdon and Sophie hid from the pursuit of the French police, Silas was back in Saint-Sulpice to pray and ask a sister about the rose line regarding the church.
Very church.
It hides beneath.
Elsewhere, Professor Langdon and Sophie were in a park to solve the riddle of who was behind this incident. They believed that this whole incident had something to do with events in the past when the Vatican created the Knights Templar.
The church would kill to possess. The key your grandfather left you.
In a different place, Bishop Manuel Aringarosa met with several bishops. He said that the Holy Grail would soon be destroyed. Professor Langdon and Sophie headed to a place where the key was addressed. Arriving at the place, they realized that the key was the key to a safe from a bank. To open it, they had to know the account number. So Professor Langdon and Sophie attempted to decipher the clue to the account number based on a message sent by Sonnier. When the safe was opened, they saw that the contents of the safe were a box with a rose symbol associated with the Holy Grail. The police knew Professor Langdon and Sophie were at the bank. They both rushed off through a secret passage that had been prepared by a special officer for them. When they opened the rose box, they realized that the box was a cryptic containing a message that must be deciphered. If they were wrong in cracking the code, then the message in the box would be destroyed forever.
Write the information on a papyrus scroll.
The officer who brought them both suddenly stopped the car and fired a gun at Professor Langdon. Luckily, they both survived.
Step back!
Then they rushed to meet Sir Lee Teabing. Sir Lee Teabing was an old friend of Professor Langdon who felt to be able to help solve the riddles of the Holy Grail, the Abbey of Sion, and the death of Sonnier. Arriving at Chateau Villette, Professor Langdon asked Lee about Sion Abbey. Lee said that the monastery of Zion protected the source of the church's power on earth, namely the Holy Grail. Lee also explained the history of the beginning of the division in Rome until the crucifixion of Jesus.
Christ's followers had grown.
Lee showed the painting of the Last Supper by Da Vinci to Professor Langdon and Sophie. He explained to Professor Langdon and Sophie that in the painting there was never a glass-shaped Holy Grail, so it was concluded that the Holy Grail was not a glass, but a symbol of a woman. Lee explained that during this time Jesus had a child who was born to one of his disciples, namely Mary Magdalene. At the time Jesus was crucified, Mary Magdalene hid and gave birth to her child named Sarah. Lee believed that all this time the modern church had changed the real facts.
Some say millions. Imagine then, Robert.
But soon Lee found out that Professor Langdon and Sophie were fugitives from the police. Lee asked them both to leave the house. But Professor Langdon told Lee that Sophie was the granddaughter of Saunière. As an obsessive researcher of the Abbey, Lee was silent, and Professor Langdon said that Jacques Saunière was on the list of people who may become Grand Master. Shortly after Professor Langdon showed the rose box to Lee, he believed again and began to solve the puzzle in the box. He said that in the box contained a map that led to the Holy Grail. When they tried to crack the code, suddenly Silas came and attacked Professor Langdon. He asked Lee to put down the box of roses.
That is trifling.
But when Silas wanted to take the box, Lee beat Silas until he was unconscious. When Silas was unconscious, they were accompanied by Lee's bodyguard and fled by car with Silas because French police officers were already in front of the Chateau Villette and broke down the gate.
Kill the living descendants of Jesus Christ.
Captain Fash that had arrived at Chateau Villette found out that Calais had lost track of Professor Langdon, but Calais felt that Captain Fash tended not to be open to this investigation, so Calais felt suspicious of Captain Fash's behavior. Elsewhere, Professor Langdon and the others managed to escape using Lee's private plane. Meanwhile, Captain Fash was already at the Flight Command Center to request flight schedules so that he knew the whereabouts of Professor Langdon. On the plane, when Sophie asked about the life of Maria Magdalene to Lee, Professor Langdon suddenly solved a puzzle in the rose box and found an inscription containing the burial place of the Templar Knights. They rushed to change their flight path to London.
We need a mirror.
Captain Fash, desperately chasing Professor Langdon, told Calais that he got a message from the bishop that he should arrest Professor Langdon. Professor Langdon, Sophie, and Lee managed to trick the police who tried to stop them at the airport. The three of them rushed towards the Templar's tomb. While trying to solve the real location, Remy, Lee's bodyguard, pointed a gun at Professor Langdon, and it turned out that all of this had been planned. He also contacted Silas. When Silas put Lee into the trunk, Professor Langdon and Sophie escaped from the pursuit of Remy.
Whine to me about the wasted space.
Remy, who turned out to be the mastermind of this series of events, headed for the location of Opus Dei's house.
And you will be rewarded. I will dispose of the...
While Professor Langdon and Sophie headed to the library. Then in a different place, Remy met someone whom he called the Master. Remy received wages from the work he did, but after drinking the drink from Master, Remy lost his life. It turned out that the person he calls Master was Sir Lee Teabing.
Constellations. Signs of the zodiac. In London lies a knight, a pope, and two.
Professor Langdon and Sophie discovered the fact that Sir Lee Teabing killed all the protectors of the Holy Grail, including Saunière. They met at the last location where the cup was. At the Opus Dei house, Silas was chased by the police and accidentally shot Bishop Aringarosa. Bishop Aringarosa told Silas that they had been betrayed.
We are betrayed. My son. How would you know this killer's name?
Lee asked Professor Langdon to kneel and asked Sophie to solve the puzzle in the rose box, but Sophie insisted that she could not open the box. Professor Langdon offered to help, but he tricked Lee and destroyed the box instead. Not long after, the London police along with Captain Fash came and arrested Lee. Professor Langdon, who managed to crack the code, said that the location of the real Holy Grail was in the Rosslyn Church, which was built by the Templars. Professor Langdon and Sophie entered the church and she was reminded of her childhood memories. She entered the basement, and then they found a path to a different place. In the end they found the tomb, which was believed to be the tomb of Mary Magdalene. There Professor Langdon found a newspaper in the room, and he began to realize that this was not all about the Holy Grail, and Jacques Saunière was not Sophie's real grandpa. He tried to hide the true identity of Sophie and that she was the last descendant of Jesus Christ. Knowing this, Sophie was shocked, and when they left the room, all the Sion monks were waiting for her and they promised to protect Sophie.
Welcome home, child. Free of Sion, but to you, sir.
At the end of this film, Sophie and Professor Langdon bid farewell. When Professor Langdon was in his apartment, he realized other things had not been resolved. At first Professor Langdon thought that Mary Magdalene was buried in the crypt of Rosslyn Church, but according to the clues he managed to solve, the tomb was hidden under the Louvre Museum. And the film ends.